Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Today marks 1 year since President Lee Jae Myung took office, following one of the most turbulent periods in South Korea's modern political history. Over the past 12 months, his administration has focused on restoring democratic institutions after the martial law crisis, while pursuing a pragmatic approach to governance. From appointing figures from both conservative and progressive camps to expanding diplomacy with the U.S., China, and Japan, the government has often sought to move beyond traditional political divisions. While supporters say that it has helped stabilize the political landscape, critics argue that questions remain over polarization, leadership style, and whether economic gains are being felt by ordinary Koreans. So 1 year on, how has Korean democracy changed, and what legacy is the Lee administration beginning to leave behind? For answers to this, we connect to Young-Ju Ryu, professor of Korean literature at the University of Michigan. A very big welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And also joining us is Robert Kelly, professor of international relations at Busan National University. Good to see you again, Professor.
Thanks for having me again.
So first, let's start a discussion with Professor Ryu. So President Lee Jae Myung, he took office at a time when Korean society was deeply divided following the martial law crisis and impeachment turmoil. So now, a year later, do you think the Korean democracy has regained a sense of stability and direction?
The short answer would be yes, but a qualified yes, depending on who we have in mind when we say Korean democracy. The Lee Jae Myung administration, or the South Korean party politics more broadly, the Korean citizenry at large, I think these actors can be discussed separately. About the Lee Jae Myung administration, there's a wide consensus that the report card at the 1 year mark is quite good. The administration has moved decisively toward the reform of those elements in the government that had led to the martial law crisis in the first place, such as prosecutorial corruption and overreach. And it's doing that reform agenda with relative stability by focusing on 내란 종식 rather than 적폐청산, as Koreans call that. In other words, rather than calling for the draining of the swamp as a whole, the administration has adopted a more targeted approach toward bringing the insurrectionists to justice. And it's doing that speedily in the first years of the administration rather than dragging it out. But if we fix our eyes on party politics, the answer grows a bit murkier. So a year into the Lee presidency, the People Power Party has shrunk in size, but it has moved further right ideologically. And in a two-party system, when the Conservative Party becomes extreme far-right minority, the ruling party moves rightward as well to snatch up the voters left behind. Without a viable third party on the left to take up the progressive position in a more muscular fashion, the situation can raise some complicated questions for Korean democracy going forward. And finally, on the citizenry question, my answer is also yes. But let me elaborate that a little bit later in this program.
All right, we'll be waiting for that, Professor Ryu. But going back to the elections, many overseas Korean scholars back then argued that Korean democracy itself was at stake. And as somebody who publicly supported President Lee at that time, do you feel the past year has moved Korea closer to a democratic recovery that many have been hoping for?
Yes, I was a member of a community of scholars based in the United States who publicly supported Lee Jae Myung in 2022 when he first ran for the presidency. We became even more vocal and more organized after Yoon's martial law declaration in December 2024 and the political sequence that followed. From December 2024 to June 2025, what united us was indeed a very deep concern for Korean democracy under threat. But the dominant emotion we felt at the time and the overwhelming response we got from the non-Koreans around us was one of utter bewilderment. The question constantly was, how could this be happening in South Korea, which is an advanced nation in terms of culture, politics, and economy, And there, how could a sitting president order a military coup, something we wouldn't even expect of a third world developing nation? Then followed a completely peaceful overcoming of that crisis, largely through the power of the informed people and the sophistication and creativity with which the citizens organize themselves. At the University of Michigan, where I teach, I discussed this political sequence with my students. And several of my American students told me afterwards that they wish that they could be Koreans. So the combination of a democracy that has proven to be extremely vulnerable and fragile on the one hand, and extremely potent and dynamic on the other, I think this is a Korean conundrum that scholars like us are still struggling to fully understand. A universalist, a procedural definition of democracy that we might find in a textbook somewhere simply cannot capture and explain South Korea today. So in that sense, I think what we are witnessing is not merely a recovery of democracy that was nearly lost, but the emergence of a new model of democracy at a time when the world, including the United States, is in sore need of inspiration in this regard.
Now, Professor, let's delve deeper into the practices of the Lee administration then. It has been emphasizing what we call open governance, including live broadcasts of cabinet meetings and more direct communication with the public. Do you think these efforts have strengthened democratic transparency and also public trust as well?
As a way of answering the question, let me return to the issue of the citizenry that I bypassed earlier. Here, I'm really reminded of the title of Lee Jae Myung's book, which was published just a couple of months before the presidential election. The title being, in the end, the citizens will get the job done, or in Korean, 결국 국민이 합니다. To my mind, Lee Jae Myung is the least elitist president in all of Korean history, someone who directly identifies with and is of the people. As we all know, Lee Jae Myung's journey to the Blue House was tortuous, if not perilous. He was targeted again and again by the prosecution. His career was on the brink of ending numerous times. And at each of these times, the citizens came to his rescue. And that support grew, and that's the support that ultimately put him in the Blue House. And it put him in the Blue House as a servant of the people, not the master. Lee himself refers to himself as mosim in Korean, or servant, and the Korean citizens as the master. The motto for Lee Jae Myung's administration is popular sovereignty, or 국민주권. And I believe for Lee Jae Myung administration, this is not just lip service, but a matter of deep conviction. So open governance is Lee Jae Myung's way of taking the government directly to the citizens and of reporting what the Muslim has done to the people who deserve to know because they are the masters. That's what 국민주권 means.
Right.
Keeping citizens informed and enlightened keeps also populism at bay.
Right. Let's also bring in Professor Kelly into the conversation. So another defining feature of the Lee administration's first year has been the pragmatic approach, appointing figures from both progressive and conservative camps while pushing policies that cross traditional ideological lines. How much has this reshaped the political image of the administration?
Yeah, I actually think it's helped it a great deal. I think the big problem on the Korean right is that it simply is unable to move past Yoon Suk-yeol, right? As was just mentioned, there's still sort of all these candidates out there that sort of are unwilling to accept just how far President Yoon went. And what this has done is this created some space on the center right in South Korea for the Democratic Party to expand, sort of reach traditional center right voters who are not going to vote for parties that believe in insurrection or sort of self-coup or whatever we're supposed to call this thing. And I think this is really smart, right? This is a good way to sort of build a kind of consensual, centrist-oriented government that hopefully can build, I would imagine this is what the president is thinking, that can build some achievements that will actually survive his presidency, particularly if another conservative comes in, right? This has traditionally been sort of a problem in Korea. You get these big sort of left-right swings as the presidency moves from one partisan alignment to another, right? We saw this with Lee Jae Myung, for example, right? He made it really clear that he wanted to sort of like build structures with North Korea that could survive a conservative successor, and they didn't, right? And so if you're Lee Jae Myung, you can do that this time because the conservatives really, honestly, they kind of disgraced themselves by their inability to move beyond what happened a couple of years ago, right? And that's created room for the Democrats to build a fairly substantial coalition. I mean, it's kind of amazing that they sort of dominate national politics. I mean, that's actually sort of unprecedented, right? I mean, you should see what we call thermostatic public opinion, right? Whereas one party does really well in time, that should lead to a bounce back by the other party. And that's not really happening in Korea. And again, I think that's probably because of this inability to move beyond the Yoon period on the right. And this has given the Lee Jae Myung administration a lot of space to sort of build bridges with pragmatic conservatives and sort of win over center-right voters. So I think this is actually really, really smart, and it's going to probably leave a legacy.
So with a lot of support from the public, the Lee administration has pursued both pro-labor and pro-business policies at the same time, Professor Kelly. So they also emphasize industrial competitiveness and deregulation in some sectors. Do you think this approach is beginning to kind of change Korea's traditional left-right political framework?
My guess is probably not. My own sense, again, is that sort of the Korean right and Korean left are sort of fairly far apart, that there really is sort of sharp polarization in Korea. The president can try to overcome that to a certain extent. And like I said, I think sort of the Korean right's inability to move beyond what happened 2 years ago creates space for an expansion of the center-left coalition, but it's not going to break down the hard right in South Korea, which is a good third of the population. So I actually am kind of skeptical about that. I mean, it's worth trying, right? I mean, why not? But I would actually argue that these things, what you're talking about, deregulation, all that's actually being sort of driven by economic need, right? I think there's a fairly wide consensus that Korea's economy is too controlled, is too oligarchic, right? And certainly people on the left in Korea think the Gini coefficient is too high. I would actually argue that's not really the case, but I think there's sort of a fair amount of consensus out there, particularly on the left and there in the government, that the economy needs to be more open, right? It needs to be less sort of dominated by a few mega corporations, and so these kinds of arguments work well, and I think the Lee government is going to run with that, again, because it sort of resonates with the sort of centrists, unmoored voting contingency, right, that we just discussed, that they just aren't going to, these sort of unmoored center-right voters are not going to go with the conservatives because of the radicalism on hand in the last year and a half, and this gives Lee some room to sort of run and talk to them or reach out to them a little bit on the labor and economic issues you're talking about.
But when it comes to foreign policy, Professor Kelly, critics have once warned that the Lee administration could take a more anti-U.S. or anti-Japan direction. But over the past year, we've actually seen active diplomacy with Beijing and Washington and Tokyo as well. How would you assess President Lee's pragmatic foreign policy so far?
Yeah, I think it's really worked out well, and I would imagine that there's some veterans in this administration who were around when Moon Jae-in was president, and Moon Jae-in really did run an ideological foreign policy, and it collided pretty severely with South Korean conservatives who started saying in public, he's a Marxist and stuff like that. I think if you're Lee Jae Myung, you're trying to avoid that. You're trying to sort of avoid the sharp polarization that was the case the last time the South Korean left had the presidency. And I think that's why after, as a candidate, when Lee Jae Myung said South Korea should sit out a Taiwan conflict, after that, the Americans sort of snapped back at that really fast, right? The think tank pushback on that was really, really sharp. And after that, Lee Jae Myung never said anything like that. I would imagine that a lot of people in this coalition are thinking that, right? They're sort of uncomfortable with the course of Trumpism in the United States. They're uncomfortable with getting sucked into Taiwan if there's a conflict there. But they're not actually going to talk about it. They're not going to be nearly as vociferous as the Moon administration has been. And I think that's been pretty smart, right? That sort of helped keep the peace with the Americans, right? Donald Trump is wrecking U.S. alliances in the North Atlantic, and that hasn't happened here. I think that's actually a great achievement by the Lee administration. And he's also sort of kept the Chinese from being too unhappy, right? Everybody knows that sort of Korea's caught between the two and sort of being squeezed. And the president, I think, has done a pretty good job maneuvering between those two shoals. Surprisingly well, actually, given that, Donald Trump's president of the United States, he's actually worked out pretty well. There hasn't been an explosion like there has been with the Europeans, so give him credit for that.
Right. We've really been seeing some pragmatic moves on that front. Now, when it comes to the economy, again, the government, it points to achievements like AI investment, stronger exports, and the sharp rise in stock market as well. But critics say many Korean citizens still don't really fully feel these gains in our daily lives. Professor Liu, how important will that gap between economic indicators and public perception would become going forward?
I think it's tremendously important, and I expect the gap to close significantly in Lee's second year. In some ways, the first year of the Lee administration was spent removing the kind of blockages that have traditionally impeded Korean economy from functioning more sensibly and making good on its potential. For example, the so-called Korea discount that had artificially depressed the Korean stock market. The year that we just witnessed it was also one of extraordinary tumult and uncertainty in the world, given the Donald Trump's U.S.-imposed tariffs and the back and forth and all the waffling around tariff policy, as well as the impact of new and ongoing wars. And so I agree that the Lee Jae Myung administration did an excellent job hedging those risks and building up Korea's global standing at a difficult time. Next year, in year two, there's some tailwinds helping the Lee administration, I believe, including his historic tax revenues from the semiconductor industry. I'm expecting macroeconomic indicators to translate into more meaningful dividends that may be felt by everyday citizenry. After all, Lee Jae Myung is at heart a president, I think, who believes in basic income, and that's what his record in Seongnam attests to. So some of the policies that will be felt by the Main Street, I think, will materialize after in the second year, now that the local elections are done.
So ultimately, we'll see how public perceptions may actually matter just as much as the economic data itself moving forward. Now, at the same time, some critics argue that the administration still relies heavily on President Lee's personal leadership style and political instincts as well. Professor Kelly, do you see any risks in this kind of governance?
Yeah, I think he's got a bit of a rock star kind of quality to him, I suppose, right? I'm not sure if he's sort of at Obama levels, but, I mean, there's a bit of that. I think a lot of that is just sort of a reaction to what Yoon Suk-yeol had done, right? Which is sort of drag Korea through the mud for 6 months, right? And so there's a sense that when President Lee came in, that things were new and different, and at least he's committed to democracy and everything. Again, sort of, if you're a center-rightist who's frightened about where the far right in Korea is going, which is sort of like, refusing to admit what Yoon has done. If you're sort of a center-right, center-left kind of voter, you look at Lee Jae Myung and you say, oh my God, thank God, at least he believes in democracy. So I think there's some of that, right? But that will eventually sort of fade, right? In time, presidents make mistakes, they do things people don't like, and opinions polls start to drop. I'm actually rather impressed that President Lee's polling has remained so high. That's actually kind of uncommon. Normally in second and third years, numbers start to go down. That will probably kick in. But of course, this is the reason why Korea has term limits, right? My own sense is that Korea's one-year term limit, term limit of 5 years is actually a really good thing for exactly these purposes, right? You don't actually want sort of cult of personalities in the president's office. And so even if President Lee turns out to have that kind of charismatic authority in the next couple of years, it will eventually fade as the lame duck status kicks in sometime probably in the fourth year.
So finally, when historians actually look back on the first year of the Lee administration, Professor Kelly, what do you think they will see as the most defining impact on Korean politics and democracy as well?
Well, I'm more of a foreign policy guy than I am a domestic policy guy, so let me make the argument that I've made on your show in the past. I'm actually really, really impressed with the way the government has managed Donald Trump, right? That Donald Trump has been just very destructive to U.S. relationships elsewhere, right? In Latin America, in the Middle East, in Europe, right? I mean, Trump wants Ukraine to lose the war. He wants to take Canada, right? He wants to sort of pick a fight with with the Danes over Greenland. I mean, there's nothing like that has happened out here, right? And I think the president has really managed that very well. The American reliance relationship is core for South Korean security. It's been that way since the 50s. This is a really, really important thing for Korean elites of every stripe. And the president has managed to avoid a huge explosion in the second Trump term, which a lot of other U.S. allies have not. I kind of wonder what the sort of secret sauce is here, because I bet the Europeans would like to know. But I think when we sort of look back at the carnage that Trump is going to leave of the U.S. alliance system in the West, people are going to say, wow, at least that didn't happen here. I don't know, maybe Trump will come out to East Asia in a year and he'll blow everything up the way he's done elsewhere. But I would argue so far, keeping the geopolitical balance stable, sort of keeping Korea's basic relationships in place without a rupture like you've seen in so many other theaters, that's actually a pretty great achievement. I have a feeling that 5 years later, people are going to look back and say, wow, the Koreans really ducked the bullet while Trump went off and started a war in the Middle East.
Right. So it really does seem like the Lee administration is doing well in terms of balancing its foreign policy as well. So we'll look forward to how the second year of the Lee administration would begin. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, Professor Yu as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.